My name's Howie Lucas. I'm the pastor of Linwood Baptist Church in Linwood, Kansas. It's amazing when God crosses our path with somebody else, and we have no idea what that's going to lead to. On October 13th, 2010, God saved me and radically transformed my life in a church in Basehor, Kansas. I served there for about 10 years in student ministry, both in a volunteer and full time capacity. And in those 10 years, as I began to build relationships with students and families in Basehor, I also was able to build relationships with students and families in the Linwood community. See, Basehor and Linwood, they share a combined school district, and the city of Linwood students get bused to the city of Basehor. And so as I began to meet them and know them, I started driving to Linwood, picking them up for our Wednesday and Sunday night student ministries and our Sunday morning worship. And one day I just decided, to ask them, hey, why don't you go to church in Linwood? And their answer was shocking to me. They said that church is doing nothing. So I began to pray that God would bring somebody and make that church relevant once again in that community with the gospel of Christ. And then in March of 2020, when COVID hit, that opportunity came. A couple months later, that church decided, as it was down to 3 active members, that they were going to close the doors and sell the building. But because of a few faithful men and women from a couple surrounding cities, went down and met with them and said, hey, why don't you just give us the building and allow us to replant a church in this building and let God bring the growth? And they said yes. At first, I was just on board to help with whatever. But by October, November of 2020, it was clear to me that God was calling me to Linwood. And as difficult as it was to leave the Basehor community and the Basehor church, I was excited to run to what God was doing in Linwood. And as I mentioned earlier, we just don't know what's going to come when God crosses our path with somebody. See, 4 of those students that I used to drive to Linwood and pick up are phenomenal singers, and they're all 4 siblings. And so when we planted the church in Linwood, and I moved down there in November of that year, I asked them, hey, what do you think about coming and singing and leading our music at Linwood? And they said yes. And so for about a little over a year now, they've been leading our music, but they don't play instruments. And so we were also looking for somebody that played guitar, piano, or somebody that we could call as a part-time worship director, worship leader. And so we began posting not applications, but posting online and on social media and at the seminary for those who would be looking for that a position like that. But we got very little response, if any. But again, you just never know the paths that you cross and how God's going to work in those things. Because, see, about a year ago, I went to a pastor's conference in Alpharetta, Georgia, which is about 12 and a half hours from Kansas City, roughly where we live. Linwood's just outside of Kansas City. And while we were there, we would go to these breakout sessions. And in the breakout sessions, I met a young man named David Ford. And I just kept seeing him. Everywhere I went, he seemed to be. We were outside the hotel one night waiting for our valet to bring our cars. And I just looked over and kind of jokingly said, hey, sing us a song. And so we began a conversation that night. And he didn't sing the song, but it was just a wonderful conversation. And when we left that conference, we were about an hour and a half in our drive on the way home. And my phone rang, and I looked down, and it was David. We'd exchanged numbers. And he called, and I answered, and he said, hey, I just want you to know I'm praying for you for your trip. Is there anything that I can be in prayer for you about? And that was just so pleasant. It's just wonderful to hear from somebody. And I just couldn't get past that. But when I got home, so I called him, let him know we made it home okay. And we continue to communicate every so often for the next few months. And then those conversations began to happen more and more frequently. So about 3 or 4 months ago, I just felt as the job position still hadn't been filled, right? Nobody had felt led to even apply for it. One day I just felt the Spirit lead me to say, hey, David, what do you think about moving to Linwood, Kansas and leading our worship? And he said, are you serious? I've been praying for God to show me something. See, the amazing thing in that is I had never heard David sing up until that point. I had never heard David play guitar up until that point. But I just felt that God was saying, this is the young man for that church in that community. See, it's amazing when you just open yourself up and be vulnerable and listen to God, how some of these things fall into place. See, David and his mom came to visit our church for one weekend. They were here for 4 or 5 days. They met the people in the church. David worked with the 4 students that are singing in our church. They sounded wonderful together. Uh, and so as David and his mom went back home to Oxford, Alabama, which is about an 11 and a half hour drive from here, we continued to pray. They continued to pray, but it was clear that God was calling David to the church in Linwood. And so I called him and I said, "Hey, I'm serious. Are you ready to come?" And he said, "I'm serious. Yes, I am." See, I just can't explain in words, really. I'm just speechless at how God works, how God moves, and how God puts us together and crosses our paths. Just in a sense, by chance, right? The way most people look at it, David and I encountered one another. Just by chance, I encountered those 4 siblings in Linwood, but it wasn't. It was as I went in ministry, God worked. And so I'm excited to say that Labor Day weekend, the first weekend in September, David's moving to the Linwood area and he's going to be leading our worship. And I'm just excited to see what God's going to do as he continues to bring the growth in our lives individually and corporately, and especially in the community of Linwood.